The alert came through on a Tuesday morning at 8:51. I know the time because I was in the middle of a stand-up meeting with my engineering team, a Tuesday morning ritual, 15 minutes, the 7 of us going through the previous day's system performance numbers. My phone was face down on the table. I had a rule about phones during stand-up. The rule existed because I had built it into the culture from the beginning. No screens during the 15 minutes, full presence, full attention. The alert vibrated 3 times. The specific 3 pulse pattern I had programmed for priority flags. The kind that meant the system had caught something significant enough that a human needed to see it immediately. I turned the phone over. The flag showed the application ID, the loan amount, the institution, and the specific fraud indicators the system had identified. I read the indicators. Then I looked at the applicant name. I read it again. Then I set the phone face down and finished the stand-up. I want you to understand something about that decision. The decision to finish the meeting before responding to what I had just read. It tells you something about the man I had become in the 4 years since my marriage ended. Not the man I was during the marriage. I will describe him honestly. He was not always the man I am now. But the man the 4 years of building had produced. The man who had learned, through work and failure and the specific education of starting something from nothing in a field where everything moves fast, that the quality of a response depends entirely on the quality of the composure behind it. I finished the stand-up. I thanked the team. I waited until the room was empty. Then I picked up the phone. Miriam. My ex-wife of 4 years had applied for a commercial loan of $240,000 from a regional lending institution that was one of our platform's 23 integrated partners. She had applied using income documentation that our system's verification layer had identified as inconsistent with the tax and employment records available through our data partners. The inconsistency was specific. The documentation she had submitted showed income that was 63% higher than what the verified data sources could support. The system had flagged it automatically, the way it always flagged, the way I had designed it to flag. Without prejudice, without relationship, without any variable other than the mathematics of what was submitted versus what was verifiable. The system did not know who she was. The system did not know that the woman whose application it had stopped was the same woman who had sat across from me in a mediator's office 4 years ago and told the mediator, with the specific confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome, that my tech startup was a hobby that had consumed years of our marriage and produced nothing, and that the court should treat it accordingly. The hobby had caught her. I sat at my desk for a few minutes, quiet. The way I had learned to be quiet when the world handed you something significant and the temptation was to react before you had thought. Then I called our bank partnerships director and told her I needed to be present for the review meeting on this particular application. She asked why. I told her I had a conflict of interest that required disclosure. She asked what kind. I said, personal. I will explain in the room. She said the meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2. I said, I will be there. This is that story. I still think about whether I did the right thing. Maybe you do too after watching this. That question. The next story answers it differently than you'd expect. My name is Jerome. I grew up in Oakland, California. My mother worked the customer service desk at a regional bank for 19 years. Not a glamorous position. A position that required her to sit across from people on some of the worst days of their financial lives. People who were overdrawn, people whose loans had been declined, people who had made decisions they could not undo and needed someone to tell them what was available now. She did that work with a patience and a dignity that I have spent my adult life trying to understand fully. She never made anyone feel small. That was the thing I noticed earliest and have thought about most. Some people in that position, the institutional representative, the person with the answer the other person does not want to hear. Some people use the position to diminish. My mother never did. She found the next thing. She found what was still available. She treated every person who sat across from her desk as someone whose situation was temporary, even when it did not feel that way to them. I went to UC Berkeley, computer science, not because I had a plan, because I was good at it and the goodness had a direction to it that I trusted. I was the kind of programmer who was interested not just in whether the code worked, but in whether the architecture was sound, whether the structure would hold at scale, whether the foundation was the right foundation for what was being built on it. I spent 6 years at a financial technology company in San Francisco. Mid-level engineering, then senior engineering, then a team lead role that showed me what running a technical organization actually looked like from the inside. The product we built was a lending platform, the back-end infrastructure that powered the loan origination process for several regional banks. I understood that infrastructure more completely than almost anyone else in the organization by the time I left. What I also understood by the time I left was where it was vulnerable. Fraud in digital lending is not a new problem. It is an old problem wearing new clothes in every generation of technology. The forms change, the methods change, the specific ways that fraudulent documentation finds its way into the origination pipeline change with every new verification gap that the industry identifies and closes. But the underlying pattern, someone submitting information that is not what it claims to be, in hopes that the system's verification layer will not catch the gap, that pattern does not change. I had spent 6 years watching that pattern, understanding it, building tools to catch it. And then, one evening, I had an idea about a fundamentally different architecture for how the catching could work. Not a patch on the existing system, a different structure entirely. One that used the growing availability of verified data sources in a way that existing platforms were not using them. Not just cross-referencing submitted documents against single data points, but building a multi-source picture of a financial identity and comparing the submitted application against that picture at every dimension simultaneously. The gap detection was the product. The gaps told a story. The story told you what was real and what was not. I spent 8 months building the proof of concept. Nights and weekends, in the apartment I shared with Miriam, at a desk in the second bedroom that she had designated for my use and that she had begun, by the end of those 8 months, to refer to as the cave. She said it not meanly at first, as a description. Jerome's in the cave, the way some people describe a person's focused working state. But over time, the description acquired a tone, a temperature, the specific temperature of a person who has decided that the thing in the cave is taking something from them and has chosen a name for it that communicates that decision. I want to tell you about Miriam before I tell you about the 3 moments, because the 3 moments only make sense if you understand who she was and who she was not. She was not a bad person. I have said this in other contexts about other people, and I will keep saying it because it is almost always true that the people who hurt us are not primarily bad. She was a person with specific requirements for the life she had decided she was going to live, specific requirements about visibility and pace, and the specific way that progress was supposed to look. She had grown up watching her father build a business slowly and watching her mother be frustrated by the slowness, and she had made a decision, somewhere in her own history, that she was not going to be her mother, that she was not going to be the person waiting at the table while someone else was in the cave. She had married a builder and then discovered that building required a cave and that the cave was real and that the real cave was not compatible with the life she had decided she was going to live. I do not entirely blame her for that. The incompatibility was real. It was just not what either of us had expected it to be. We married at 32. I was 34. The company was 2 years old, not yet generating revenue, but with the first bank partnership in late-stage negotiation. The proof of concept had become an actual product. The actual product was attracting serious attention from people who understood the problem it was solving. What it had not yet produced was the specific, visible evidence of success that the life Miriam had decided to live required. That gap, between what was being built and what was visible, was where the marriage came apart. 3 moments. 3 specific, datable, precisely located moments that show you the full architecture of what those years looked like from the inside. The first happened in year 2 of our marriage, which was year 4 of the company. I had just closed the second bank partnership. Not a letter of intent, a signed agreement. A real contract with a real institution, with revenue terms that would, over the course of the following year, produce numbers I had been working toward since the beginning. I came home with the specific energy of a man who has been building towards something for a long time and has just cleared a significant obstacle. Miriam was in the kitchen. I told her. I described the partnership, the terms, the what it meant. She looked at me. She said, "When does the money actually start?" I said, "The integration period is 90 days. Then it goes live and the revenue starts accruing." She said, 90 days. I said, "Yes." She said, "Jerome, that is what you said about the first one. 90 days. And then there were delays and it was 140 days and the money was less than you projected." I said, "The first integration had specific technical issues that we identified and corrected. This one is cleaner." She said, "Okay." She went back to what she was doing. I stood in the kitchen. I thought about the contract in my bag, the one that had taken 4 years of work and 2 years of direct relationship cultivation, and 1 signed page that represented something I could not fully describe to someone who was not inside the building of it. I put my bag down. I helped with dinner. I did not bring up the contract again. The second moment happened in year 4 of our marriage, which was year 6 of the company. The company had its first significant press coverage. A fintech publication that was read by the people in the industry who made decisions. Not a mainstream article, an industry piece, specific and technical, and exactly the kind of visibility that mattered for what we were building. I showed it to Miriam. She read it. She said, "Is this the publication your mom reads?" I said, "It is an industry publication. It is not designed for general audiences." She said, "So people who know this space will see it." I said, "Exactly." She said, "But nobody we know will." I looked at her. She said, "I am not trying to be unkind. I am just saying that 4 years of work in something that only experts can see, that is a specific choice. And I need to know if this is the trajectory, if the whole of what this builds is going to be something that our family and our community see as real, or if it is always going to be something you have to explain." I said, "I am building infrastructure. Infrastructure is not designed to be visible. It is designed to work." She said, "Your mother's bank was infrastructure. You could see the building." I said, "Miriam." She said, "I know. I know it is not the same. I am trying to tell you something about what I need, and I am not sure the thing you are building can give it to me." I looked at my wife. I thought about the article, about the 4 years, about the second signed partnership and the third that was in negotiation, and the architecture that was, by that point, doing what I had designed it to do. I said, "Give me time." She said, "I have been giving you time." She was not wrong. She had been giving me time. The time just had not produced the visible evidence that the life she had decided to live required. The third moment, the worst one, the one I still carry not because of what it did to me, but because of what it showed me about what had been happening underneath the surface for longer than I had understood. The mediator's office. Year 8 of our marriage, year 10 of the company. We were in the dissolution process. Mediation before the formal filing. Miriam's attorney had prepared a financial assessment of the marital assets. The assessment of the company, my company, the one I had been building for 10 years, the one that had signed its 21st bank partnership 3 months prior, and that was, by that point, processing millions of loan applications monthly. The assessment of the company had been commissioned through a valuation firm that Miriam's attorney had selected. The valuation was lower than the company's last funding round, significantly lower. I said to the mediator, "The valuation does not reflect current performance. The last funding round was priced at nearly double this figure. I have the documentation." Miriam's attorney said, "The valuation methodology is standard." I said, "The methodology does not account for the contracted revenue pipeline. The bank partnerships represent multi-year agreements with guaranteed minimums. None of that is reflected." The mediator looked at the documents. Miriam said, directly to the mediator, with the calm certainty of someone who has decided how this room is going to go, "Jerome's company has been promising to become something significant for 10 years. It has not become that. The partnerships are real, but the scale is still limited. It is a good, small business. It is not what he believes it is. Not what he believes it is." She said that in a room with a mediator and attorneys, about a company I had spent 10 years building, about the architecture that was, at that moment, running on 21 bank systems and catching fraud that those institutions would otherwise have paid for in loss reserves and regulatory penalties. I looked at her. I said nothing. The mediator moved on. That evening, in the empty apartment that was now navigating the mechanics of becoming less than an apartment, I sat at my desk in what had once been called the cave, and I opened the platform dashboard and I looked at the numbers. 21 partners, 4 million applications processed in the previous month, a fraud detection rate that had saved our partner institutions an estimated $31 million in the previous quarter. Not what he believes it is. I closed the dashboard. I had a decision to make about what came next. Not about the divorce. That process was proceeding correctly. About what I was going to do with what I knew and what I was building, and who I was going to become in the years after the room that had just decided what my work was worth. I made the decision the same way I made every significant decision. I went back to work. I spent years thinking no one would believe this story. Turns out, the right people always find it. If you're one of them, subscribe. There are more stories exactly like mine. The 4 years after the divorce were the most productive years of my professional life. I say this not with the satisfaction of a man who converted grief into fuel. Though there was fuel, I will not pretend otherwise. I say it because it was simply true. The removal of the specific weight I had been carrying, the ongoing negotiation between what I was building and what someone needed it to look like, produced a freedom of movement that I had not fully realized I was lacking until it was available. I moved faster, not recklessly, in the specific way of a system with reduced drag. The decisions that had required internal arbitration, the ones where the correct technical choice and the choice that would produce the right visual narrative for the marriage were not the same choice. Those decisions became clean. I made the correct technical choice, every time, without the second calculation. The platform grew. By year 2 after the divorce, we had 31 bank partners. By year 3, 44. The fraud detection architecture had been refined through 3 significant updates, each one closing gaps that previous versions had missed, and each one making the system harder to defeat by the specific methods that fraudulent applicants had been using to slip through. The methodology Miriam's attorney had used to value the company had assessed us at a number that I will not specify here because the number is not the story. What I will tell you is that 2 years after the mediator's office, an institutional investor had approached us about a partnership at a valuation that made the assessment look like a document from a different company, which, in the most important sense, it was. The company that had been assessed in that room was the company she had described. The company that existed 2 years later was the one I had believed was possible. What he believes it is. He had been right. I did not think about Miriam often. I want to be accurate about this. She was not a present concern in my daily life. She had moved on to a life she was building on her own terms, and I wished her well in the genuine sense. Not the performative sense of a person saying what is expected, but the real sense of a man who understood that the incompatibility had been real, and that her pursuit of the life she needed was legitimate. I did not track her. I did not maintain contact. We had no children. The dissolution had been clean, if not without difficulty. We had gone our separate directions with our separate lives. I had not thought about her in several months when the Tuesday morning alert appeared. The flag identified income documentation inconsistency at 63% above verified sources. That is not a borderline case. That is not a rounding error or an ambiguous data source or a legitimate discrepancy between self-reported and verified income. 63% above verified sources across 3 independent data channels is a specific thing. It is documentation that has been constructed to show a financial picture that the underlying data does not support. I looked at the flag for a long time. I thought about our platform's core principle, the one I had written into the founding documentation and had stated in every external communication since. The system is neutral. It does not know the applicant. It knows the numbers. The numbers either align or they do not. The system flags the misalignment. The human review takes it from there. The system had done its job. Now I had to do mine. I called our bank partnerships director, whose name is Vanessa. She had been with the company for 3 years and was one of the people who understood what we had built at the level that mattered. Not just the functionality, but the purpose. She understood that the platform existed to protect the integrity of the lending process, for institutions and for borrowers. The fraud it caught was not abstract. It was the difference between a lending institution maintaining the trust of its depositors and having to absorb losses that eventually fell on people who had nothing to do with the fraudulent application. She understood the stakes. When I told her I had a conflict of interest in the Thursday review, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you want to recuse yourself?" I said, "No. I want to be present, and I want to disclose the conflict in the room." Recusal would protect me. It would not serve the process. She said, "That is a harder position." I said, "It is the correct one." She said, "Thursday at 2." I arrived at the lending institution's offices at 1:45. The review meeting was in a conference room on the 3rd floor. The institution's fraud review officer, a man named David, was already there. Vanessa was there, the institution's general counsel, 2 members of their risk management team, and an empty chair across the table, the chair where the applicant was expected to sit. I sat down with our team. At 2:03, the door opened. She came in the way she had always come into rooms, with the particular composure of a person who has prepared themselves for a difficult conversation and has decided in advance that they are going to manage it rather than be managed by it. She sat down. She looked at the table. She looked at David. She looked at the institution's counsel. Then she looked at me. I watched it happen. The recognition, the specific sequence I had seen in other rooms, in other contexts, the immediate, complete recognition, then the calculation, then the arrival at the understanding of what room she was actually in. She said my name. I said, "Hello, Miriam." David said, "Ms. Miriam, thank you for coming in. We have asked the principals of our fraud detection platform to join us today because the flag on your application was generated by their system, and given the nature of the specific indicators, we wanted them present for the review." He said it professionally, without drama, the way fraud review officers speak, with the specific neutrality of people who have learned that the facts carry enough weight on their own without requiring additional tone. Miriam said, "Jerome, what is this?" I said, "This is a fraud review meeting. You received a notice from the institution explaining that your loan application had been flagged for review." She said, "I know what the notice said. I mean, what are you doing here?" I said, "My company's platform flagged your application. I have a conflict of interest that I am disclosing in this room. That conflict is that you and I were previously married. It does not change the data. The system flagged your application before I saw the applicant name. The flag was generated by the numbers, not by any knowledge of who you were." She looked at me for a long moment. David said, "Ms. Miriam, I want to walk through the specific indicators that generated the flag. Our platform compares submitted income documentation against verified data from multiple independent sources. Your application submitted income documentation showing annual income of $168,000. Our verification system cross-referenced that figure against tax records, employer verification data, and independent income estimate models. Those sources indicate annual income of approximately $103,000. Miriam was very still. David said, "The 63% discrepancy between the submitted documentation and the verified data was the flag trigger. I would like to give you the opportunity to explain this discrepancy." Miriam looked at the table. "I want to tell you what I was feeling in that moment. Not what the room might have expected me to feel, what I actually felt. It was not satisfaction. I want to be honest about that, the way I have tried to be honest about everything in this telling. It was not the clean, bright feeling of a man watching the correct outcome arrive at the correct moment. It was something quieter, something that was closer to sadness than anything else. Not grief. The grief for the marriage had run its course 4 years ago, and I had processed it and set it down and moved on. Sadness in the more abstract sense. Sadness that this was where a person who had once been my wife had arrived. That the specific combination of her needs and her decisions had produced this room. I had not built the platform to catch Miriam. I had built it to catch fraud. It had caught fraud. The fact that the fraud belonged to someone I had once known in a completely different context did not change what it was. It just made it more complicated to sit with. Miriam said, "I would like to speak with my attorney before I respond to the specific questions." David said, "Of course, that is your right." She looked at me. She said, "Jerome, I need to understand something." I said, "What do you need to understand?" She said, "Your company, the platform." She gestured at the documents in front of David. "This is what you built." I said, "Yes." She said, "How many institutions?" I said, 44 currently." She was quiet. She said, "How many applications?" I said, "We processed 6.3 million applications last month." She looked at the table. She said, very quietly, not to the room, to herself, in the specific way of someone making an inventory of their own conclusions, "Not what he believes it is." I said nothing. She looked at me. There was something in her face that I had not seen there in the last years of our marriage, something that was not the composure, not the assessment, not the specific management of a situation by a person who had decided in advance how it was going to go. It was the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they had not expected and is trying to orient. She said, "You could have recused yourself." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Because the system flagged a fraudulent application, and the correct response to a fraudulent application is a review. My history with the applicant does not change what the numbers say. Recusing myself would have been more comfortable for me. It would not have been more correct." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I need to speak with my attorney." David said, "Of course." She stood. Before she left the room, she stopped at the door. She did not turn fully around. She said, to the room, and to no one in particular, "He always did the correct thing, even when it cost him." Then she walked out. The room was quiet for a moment. Vanessa looked at me. I looked at the table. David said professionally, "We will reconvene when the applicant has consulted with counsel, likely early next week." I said, "I will be available." I gathered my materials. I stood up. I shook David's hand. In the elevator going down, Vanessa said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I am." She said, "That was a complicated room." I said, "Most rooms where the truth has to come out are complicated." She said, "You know this is going to be a story people tell." I said, "The story is not mine to control. The decision about how to be in the room was mine. I made it correctly." She nodded. We walked out into the afternoon. What Miriam said to her attorney that evening, what the attorney's assessment was of her options, what decisions she made in the days that followed, that is a story for another day. What happened to my family didn't make headlines. It never does. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be heard. Subscribe. We tell the stories that don't. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my mother after the divorce. I drove to Oakland. I sat at her kitchen table, the same kitchen table I had sat at my entire childhood, the same table where she had told me about the people who came to her desk at the bank and what they needed and what was still available. I told her what had happened, the mediator, the valuation, not what he believes it is. She listened the way she had always listened, fully, without interrupting, without preparing her response while I was still speaking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Jerome, can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "When you built the system, the fraud detection, the verification layer, all of it, what were you trying to protect?" I said, "The lending process, the integrity of it, people who apply honestly and get assessed honestly, institutions that can trust the information they are working with." She said, "And people on the other side of the desk." I said, "Yes, people like you, people who have to sit across from someone and give them an honest answer about what is available. That answer should be based on real information, not constructed information." She said, "So you built something to protect people like me?" I said, "In a way, yes." She said, "Then you did not build it for the wrong reason." She picked up her coffee cup. She set it down. She said, "What Miriam said in that room, about what she believed it was, that was not about your company. That was about what she needed to believe to make the decision she had already made." I said, "I know." She said, "People decide what things are worth before they look carefully. They have always done that. It is not new." I said, "I know." She said, "The system looks carefully. That is what you built. A thing that looks carefully before it decides." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is your mother's son." I thought about that for a long time. The system looks carefully before it decides. That is the thing. That is the core of everything I had spent 15 years building. not a tool to catch criminals. There are better words for what the platform actually is. It is a verification system, a truth detection system, a mechanism that says, before we decide what this is, let us look at it carefully. Let us compare what we are being told against what is independently verifiable. Let us find the gap, if there is one, before we proceed. The gap between what is submitted and what is true. I had spent 15 years building a machine that could find that gap. And sitting in that conference room on the third floor of a lending institution on a Thursday afternoon, I had found it in a place I had not expected to find it. Not in a stranger's application. In the application of a woman who had sat across from a mediator 4 years ago and described my work as not what he believes it is. A woman who had made a calculation about the lending process, about what was verifiable, about whether the system would catch what she had submitted, and who had made that calculation without knowing that the system doing the checking was mine. I do not tell you this to draw a line between us. I do not tell you this so that you can say, she deserved it. I am not interested in she deserved it. I am interested in what is true. And what is true is that the gap between what she submitted and what the verified data showed was real. The system found it. The room was convened. The process proceeded correctly. That is all it was. The system doing what the system was designed to do. You probably know something about what I am describing. Not the technology, the principle. The gap between what someone shows you and what is actually there. The gap between the self they present and the self that the independent data sources in your own life would verify. You have encountered that gap. Maybe in a marriage. Maybe in a business partnership. Maybe in a friendship or a family relationship where someone's account of themselves and the verifiable reality of their behavior did not align in the way they were asserting. And you had a choice. You could accept the submitted documentation. You could take what was presented at face value and proceed on the basis of what you were told rather than what you could independently confirm. That is the easier path. It requires less of you. It keeps the surface smooth. Or you could look carefully. You could compare what you were being told against what you could independently verify. You could find the gap. Looking carefully is harder. It costs something. It disrupts arrangements that have been comfortable for everyone on the basis of the submitted documentation being accepted. It produces rooms like the one on the third floor. Rooms where the gap is visible, and the room has to decide what to do with it. Those rooms are not comfortable. I will not tell you they are comfortable, but they are honest. And honest rooms, even when they are uncomfortable, are the ones where actual decisions can be made, where the actual situation, rather than the submitted version of the situation, can be addressed. My mother sat across from people at that desk for 19 years. Some of them had submitted the correct documentation and were denied on the honest merits. Some of them had not submitted the correct documentation and needed to understand what the correct process was. She treated both with the same care. She found what was still available. She did not diminish anyone for the gap. That is what I tried to build into the platform. Not a punitive system, a careful one. A system that looks before it decides and finds what is verifiably true before it proceeds. The platform currently has 47 bank partners. We are in negotiation with 4 more. The fraud detection rate has saved our partner institutions over $200 million in loss reserves in the previous fiscal year. Those are real numbers. Numbers that correspond to real applications and real institutions and real people on both sides of the lending process. Not what he believes it is. He believed it was something that could protect the integrity of the process for everyone in it. He was right. I drove to Oakland last month. I sat at the kitchen table. My mother poured coffee. She asked about the platform. I told her the numbers. She listened the way she always listened. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have understood this." I said, "What would he have understood?" She said, "That the most important thing in any transaction is what is actually true, not what is submitted, not what is presented, what is actually true." I said, "He knew that from the docs." She said, "He knew it from being a black man in a world that had a tendency to submit documentation about him that did not match the verified data." I looked at her. She said, "You built something that insists on the verified data, that says, before we decide what this is worth, let us look carefully at what it actually is." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is not a small thing, baby." I said, "No, it is not." She poured more coffee. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window the way it has always come through that window, in the specific angle of late afternoon in Oakland that I have known since I was old enough to notice light. I sat at my mother's table. I drank my coffee. I thought about the alert that had come through on a Tuesday morning, and the meeting on Thursday afternoon, and the room where the gap had been found and named and processed correctly. And I thought, the system worked. That is all it was. The system worked. If this story felt familiar, if you have ever built something that the people around you could not see clearly enough to value, subscribe. I will be here next week with another story about builders and verifiers, about the gap between what is submitted and what is true, and about the quiet, specific satisfaction of a correctly built thing doing exactly what it was designed to do. Keep building. Keep looking carefully. The gap is always findable.